Hello and welcome again as we consider yet another multiple choice question for IB Chemistry. The graph shows the values of delta G for a reaction at different temperatures, and here you have the graph and then you have to say which statement is correct. Now, delta G, the Gibbs free energy. You need to know a bit about the Gibbs free energy, of course, and how it affects the spontaneity of a reaction. But you must begin, of course, by reading this graph. So, in looking at this graph, you see delta G on this axis here, the y-axis, temperature T in Kelvin on this axis. Then you notice that as the temperature increases, because here you have 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, and so on, as this temperature is increasing, the Gibbs free energy is going from a positive value to a negative value. When that happens, of course, you need to know that a negative Gibbs free energy gives a spontaneous reaction. Now, if a reaction is spontaneous at all temperatures, then it has a delta H value, an enthalpy change value that's negative, it's exothermic, and it has an entropy change value that is positive. So these are the two indicators of a system that is always going to be spontaneous. Delta G would always be negative if you have a negative delta H and a positive delta S. You know that delta G isn't always negative, because here you can see delta G has become negative at higher temperatures, and then at lower temperatures it was positive. So that's a sign that this reaction is not always spontaneous. And when you have a reaction that's not always spontaneous, it means it's got to be a positive delta H going along with a positive delta S. That would give you a spontaneous process. This too would give you a spontaneous process, a negative delta H with a negative delta S. But what would give you a process that's never spontaneous would be the opposite of this first one, which would be a positive delta H and a negative delta S. Now, because this reaction is spontaneous, in other words, a negative delta G at higher temperatures is pushing it forward. Higher temperatures is allowing it to become spontaneous. You have to think of this just as you would think of an exothermic or an endothermic system. And now, thinking of this as an exothermic or an endothermic system with spontaneity happening at higher temperatures, then what type of reaction would that be in terms of the enthalpy change? If a higher temperature is favoring the reaction, then it's got to be endothermic. So we're going to be looking for an endothermic reaction that leads to a spontaneous process. And that would have to be this combination here that we're looking for, where you have a positive delta H and a positive delta S. The first option that we have here is the standard entropy change for the reaction is negative. Obviously, if it were positive, then that would have to be the answer, because for this to happen, this is the combination that we're looking for. A positive delta S, an increase in entropy, and a positive delta H. So A is out of the question. Then C says, at higher temperatures, the reaction becomes less spontaneous. Well, of course, we see here that at higher temperatures, we get the negative delta G, which is more spontaneous. So that too is not correct. So then we're left between B and D. And D says the standard enthalpy change of the reaction is negative. And we've established here that it's positive. And then that leaves us with B. The standard enthalpy change of the reaction is positive. Positive delta H, positive delta S. And if you need to review this entire topic, you can click on the card above. But the answer to this question is B.